Welcome to the PharmaSource podcast. Everywhere you turn, there's buzz about GLP-1s, the hottest drug market of 2024. There's been tremendous commercial success with drugs like Novo Nordisk's Ozempic, Eli Lilly's Wegovy, which are helping to revolutionize the treatment of obesity and type 2 diabetes. The GLP-1 drug market is projected to soar to at $100 billion value by 2029. So, of course, everyone wants a piece of this action. So, in this episode, I'm thrilled to be joined by Ben Locwin, Chief Scientist at Black Diamond Networks. Hi, Ben. Welcome.
Oh, thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to chat with you again.
The aim for this session is to cut through some of the hype around GLP-1s and try to explore the true impact of how it's going to transform the industry. Ben, tell us about GLP-1s. Where did they come from? Why are they so important right now?
Yeah, there's a storied history, as the saying would go. So GLP-1s, I feel like it's almost a situation where the listeners have probably heard a lot about these or are taking them themselves. So, to try to cast this in a, maybe little different angle for people. So, for those who don't actually know what's going on with the molecule, GLP-1s are glucagon-like peptide 1. That's what the acronym stands for. And it's a hormone that influences blood sugar control, digestion, appetite in humans. And it's part of a class of hormones known as incretin hormones, and they're secreted by intestinal cells. And then also in the hindbrain, in the brainstem, there's also some certain neurons that secrete GLP-1s. And essentially what they do is in the stomach, the GLP-1 drugs inhibit gastric emptying, acid secretion, and motility, which collectively those things decrease appetite for the user. Also, by decreasing the gastric emptying, the GLP-1s reduce this postprandial, that's after eating a meal, glucose excursion, which is another attractive property for diabetes, for weight management and treatment. And I think that effect is interesting because that's also why some of the folks who take GLP-1 based drugs occasionally experience nausea. So there's kind of a dual mechanism here. The GLP-1s have effects on insulin production as well as glucagon production. And for those who may not be familiar with it, glucagon is a regulatory peptide hormone that basically counteracts the effects of insulin by stimulating glucose production from the liver and increases blood glucose levels. So when you take a GLP-1, it's influencing your insulin level, and it's also downregulating the amount of glucagon you have. So that's interesting from the angle that instead of only influencing insulin, so for diabetics, for example, who take insulin, it's possible to have hyperinsulinemia. You take too much insulin, for example, and that can have dire consequences. But having this other glucagon side with the GLP-1s as a glucoregulatory peptide, it's kind of a safety switch. So it's a little bit more difficult for your blood sugar to drop too low, your insulin to be too high using the GLP-1s. So when they were doing a lot of the safety studies, there's kind of a larger therapeutic window. There's a bigger safety margin with the GLP-1 drugs, which is kind of a nice thing to have with them. So that's essentially, at its heart, what's going on as far as the biology and the molecule itself with the GLP-1s.
And why are they so different from common weight loss drugs? How do they act differently?
Well, a lot of the common weight loss drugs that are out there, the history of weight loss drugs, it started a long time ago, but they were most often stimulant based. And if you recall from the history of some of those, the stimulant based weight loss drugs, essentially what they do is they raise your basal metabolic rate, your BMR. So even when resting, you're at a heightened level of thermogenesis. So your body's generating more heat, more energy is produced in the form of calories burned. Those were the first class of weight loss drugs. And a lot of that, because you're stimulating the central nervous system, there are safety effects, and a lot of those stimulant-based weight loss drugs have been pulled from the market by the FDA, the EMA, MHRA, et cetera, owing to adverse safety events that were encountered in the population. So it's difficult, as you can imagine, to try to hyperexcite the nervous system to increase thermogenesis to burn more calories and not have a very narrow therapeutic window and not have a lot of other issues come up with, how you essentially then your off-target effect is you're burning more calories, so you're losing weight, but really what those are doing is stimulating the weight loss by increased calorie
Yeah.
burn. So that's a trickier system, I think, to try to go after, whereas influencing weight loss by modulating appetite, hunger suppression, insulin, glucagon, those at the moment are showing themselves to be an incredibly powerful way for people to
Mm.
manage body weight as well as blood sugar control. And certainly, as I mentioned earlier, talking about the biochemistry of the GLP-1s, when you have a system that's influencing gastric emptying and motility, it's slowing down the digestive process. You're feeling full longer. Your satiety signals and hunger signals have altered. The flip side of that is, like I said, some users experience nausea and other
Mm.
unpleasant gastric effects, but if it doesn't fully tip to that direction, then what you're able to avail yourself of as a user is you're not as hungry as often and you feel full longer, as a couple
Mhm.
of examples. So then what happens is what's really ultimately happening there is you're tending to consume fewer calories on a daily basis. So then the whole idea of calories in versus calories out means that you're able to essentially shed more weight over a period of time relative to what your previous metabolic requirements were compared to the amount of calories you consumed
Mhm.
were at.
Great, great. Thank you, thank you. So why have they been so successful recently? Why now?
Hmm. I would say, back to the storied history. Why now is a great question. And I think a lot of it, and maybe we'll dip into this a little. I think a lot of it has to do with certainly how effective they've been at the job that they're doing. The other side of it is the social media component of it.
Hmm.
Um, the media, the press, have been covering these, showing dramatic stories of weight loss. And, whenever you have anecdotes like that, people love to hop in and say, whoa, I just saw this social media feed or saw
Mm.
this clip. This is amazing. But basically, in the 1970s, these hormones were discovered. So we're talking almost 50 years ago. So the first one was glucose-dependent insulinotropic polypeptide,
Hmm.
GIP, and that was isolated from porcine gastric extracts. And then in the late 70s into the early 80s, there was a researcher at Massachusetts General Hospital who found an antibody for incretins that identified GLP-1s, and then that led to determining how GLP-1s trigger the pancreas to produce insulin. And then by the mid 80s, so even then, 40 years
Hmm.
ago, the amino acid sequence for GLP-1 was discovered. So everything that's interesting because everything at the cutting edge of popular medicine now, and why is it so popular now, really had its seeds several decades ago. And
Mm.
it's really a relatively simple molecule. But the development had a famous cast of characters working at Novo Nordisk at the time. And, I think if you fast forward through a lot of that history, we're just in a situation where it's, right molecule, right time. There's nothing particularly advanced or complex about the molecule itself, but certainly um, for diabetes to have a very long-acting treatment to influence insulin levels is something that is very favorable for diabetics. You don't have to have injections of insulin so
Hmm.
often. And for those who are on the weight loss side of things, it's been enormously successful at producing significant weight losses in patients. So combine those two with, again, the popular press covering this, social media feeds, influencers. It's
Mm.
uh it's just a situation where it's doing what it promised to do, and the people who are interested in therapies like that, are willing to try it out, and then amassing more anecdotes about it. So it's kind of success building on and compounding former
Yeah.
success.
And the drug delivery mode is also going to make a difference, presumably. So moving from just purely being injectable based into oral solid dosage forms as well. What difference do you think that's going to make?
That's a good question. So the first GLP molecule that was discovered was liraglutide, and Lotte Bier Knudsen worked at Novo Nordisk on that as the first one.
Hmm.
That one has a 13 to 15 hour active life essentially. And that then led to semaglutide, which is now kind of the most favorable one in Ozempic and Wegovy, et cetera. That lasts 165 hours. What they basically did was take the GLP-1 molecule and they did some molecular substitutions to it so that it would bind more strongly to albumin in blood and would
Okay.
last longer in circulation. So with an oral solid dose, what you're doing is you're not having to go the route of injections, which a lot of people would prefer. But I think, at the same time, so there have been some studies that show that semaglutide tablets like Rybelsus, they're as good as the injections like Ozempic for type 2 diabetes treatment. So they have the same active ingredient, but
Hmm.
different dosage forms. But a lot of people say, well, hey, if I could just take this as a tablet, I don't have to do an injection. True. Injectables offer some benefits. They bypass gastric processing, first pass liver metabolism, etc. And in a lot of cases, it's difficult. This is why a lot of the immunotherapies, the large molecules, have to be injectable, parenteral, because there's a large complex molecule that wouldn't survive digestion and gastric bypass.
Mhm.
So finding ways to get around that is allowing for the oral solid dose. Much more convenient, but not necessarily as long acting. But then the question remains, well, if I could do an injection once a week, let's say, or we get to the point where it's once every 2 weeks, is that more palatable than taking a pill every day or a couple pills every day? And that
Mhm.
becomes a balance for the patient user of it to decide what's better for them. I should also note that the placebo effect, though, is much more pronounced with injectables than with oral solid doses.
Hmm.
So there have been some interesting research findings about that. But essentially, at the end of the day, if you take a drug via an injectable route, because there's really no clear reason why, but the thinking is it's a much more significant, aggressive way to introduce the drug into the body. So, because of
Mhm.
that, it's primed you to think, if I'm going to go this route, this must be really effective. So patients that take drugs parenterally, injectables, they find that the placebo effect in those patients is much more pronounced than people who take tablets, capsules, things of that nature.
Right,
So
right.
I think that's interesting because if you start to ask about side effects, for example, from the GLP-1s, does that also apply with the nocebo effect? So that's sort of the evil twin of the placebo effect.
Mhm.
You're expecting there to be more drug effects, whether good or bad, because you injected versus oral
Yeah,
dose.
yeah,
And is that having an impact on how much nausea you're experiencing or how many other side effects? So I think it remains to be seen, if a longer acting injectable will win out at the end, or if it's going to be we can have extended release, time released oral solid doses that all of a sudden really just take off and really sweep through the market. But at least there's a choice.
yeah.
And as far as the clinicians are concerned, for type 2 diabetes treatment anyway, the semaglutide, and there are other forms as well as we mentioned, but that works seemingly as well with oral solid dose as with the injectable.
Very interesting. If we turn our attention then to the commercial side of this, who's currently poised to capitalize on the new market? Is it just a simple two-horse race between Novo and Lilly, or are there other players who are also going to take a piece of this ever-expanding pie?
Yeah, so Novo for sure, the initial development, and Lilly, I know, is working double time to get Zepbound and Mounjaro out in massive commercial quantities, facility scale ups, new facility creation. But that's, happening across the market. Everyone is seeing, the benefits to these drugs, this new drug class,
Mhm.
and also seeing the power play going on. So then the question becomes, well, do we build our own new facility, or do we in-license an asset to sell? Do we develop our own versions of a GLP molecule? Um, I think some of the biggest players right now by patent volumes are Sanofi, Merck, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, GSK, and many others.
Hmm.
Sun Pharma, for example, has patents involved. Ipsen, Amgen, a lot of major players have filed patents in this space, and certainly it's been a lot of disruptive innovation. So people are really keen on getting into this market, which then
Mhm.
begs the question, I guess, what does market saturation look like? If you are going to develop a new asset yourself, construct a new facility, go through clinical trial process, commercialize, get it to market, you're talking years down the road. And now, how has the landscape really laid itself out from where we are now to that point a few years, several years in the future? Is there still the same market appetite? Were there new safety signals and issues identified that may affect patient uptake? Maybe there are new cardiovascular benefits, so the indications are expanded, so there'll be more appetite for it. Or
Mhm.
do a couple or a few of the major players really create market saturation so that it becomes less profitable to jump into this space? So I think a
Mhm.
lot of that's still to be seen, but it's a several horse race right now, and I think we're going to get to the point where we're going to have at least the first half dozen major players involved in this, whether they're in licensing a molecule, or developing their own. But we'll get to the point where there are a lot of different options on the market. And then it's going to be up to, which one has the most catchy, drug pitch,
Yeah.
advertisement, name, whatever. Because, there's still a question out there, why is Ozempic, for example, so memorable relative
Hmm.
to Zepbound or Mounjaro or something like that? Once that name gets out there, all of a sudden, if you're a patient, you go to your physician, your prescriber, you say, I'd like to try Ozempic.
Hmm.
It's then up to them to say, well, you know what, I could steer you to this other compound, or you asked for Ozempic, and that's easy enough. So here's a prescription for Ozempic. So there's kind of this, virtuous cycle that builds on itself, where the more the name gets out there, the more prescriptions are filled, the more people hear about that one, the less they're hearing about the other ones, which frankly are functioning in the same kind of way, and in some cases, maybe even more effective.
It's probably the wrong way to talk about it, but with this huge appetite for GLP-1s at the moment, do you think there's a risk of diverting attention and investment from other categories? If you look at what's been happening in the contract manufacturing space, for example,
Mm.
Novo swooping in and picking up those Catalent facilities, that's really reduced capacity for a lot of other therapeutic areas before. What are
Yes.
those unintended consequences that you're seeing on the rest of the industry?
Yeah, I think there's potentially a huge number of unintended consequences. So, for example, you might have facilities now where you've got clients of those manufacturers who step in and say, "We'll pay extra. We need to use this space and more space if you have it for GLP-1s. They're so
Mm.
successful. They're providing so much revenue. We've got to do it." Those, let's say, suites within those manufacturing facilities, they may be um, partially used for cell and gene therapies of different types, other biologics, what have you. But if they're all getting swallowed up in this race to get GLP-1s to market in incredibly high volumes, then those production capacities aren't being used for other therapies out there.
Hmm.
So, then having a balance is very difficult. So the balance is tipping itself much more in favor of we've got a lot of GLP-1s that we want to produce. The market appetite is there, but at the same time, there's not infinite potential to produce molecules of different types. So, there's kind of diminishing marginal returns on all the other space that we have to use when the GLP-1s are swallowing everything up.
Mm.
And I think it also brings up an interesting point about the kind of the fashion of different drugs in certain times. So, for example, in the 1990s, early to mid 90s, we started into the antidepressant realm
Mm.
where there were a lot of new selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Um, and every 10, 15 years or so, we get new punctuations along the timeline of drug development, drug discovery, what becomes sort of popular at the moment. And that's why I call it fashionicity. But the
Mm.
idea being there's certain periods of fashion within drugs where when they reach the market, people see that they can be profitable for what they're treating. And
Mm.
so other companies will come in as competitors for that. Great, competition's good for business. But then again, there's not infinite time to develop and scale out any number of other therapies. So as you're focusing on, let's say, neurology assets, you're also necessarily not focused maybe so much on other assets that you could be. So we've got periods of time that have these, very kind of stark launches and maintenance phases of drugs while they're on patent.
Mm.
And I'm wondering what that's going to look like now in this GLP-1 timeframe, not only because they're squeezing out potentially other CDMO and CMO capacity to meet needs for other therapies, but if weight loss and diabetes control are showing themselves to be so profitable at the moment, well, either go after GLP-1s or go after something like a GIP or some other similar analog that can have the same sort of treatment. So again, we're going to be in this period of pharma fashion where weight loss, blood sugar control is going to be dominating for the next 5, 10, 15 years. And so this right now, the rise of the GLP-1s is really representing this current new era of this is what the drug market is concerned most about.
Mm.
And in being so concerned about, finding revenue opportunities in this GLP-1 space, what other therapies, what other conditions and patients aren't maybe getting equivalent sorts of interest, money, and research time invested in them as they otherwise might have.
So potentially investment could dry up around rare diseases or other more niche therapies.
Yeah. And if not dry up, certainly, you'll have things you can commoditize. You'll have a portfolio, let's say, of GLP-1 that you're focusing on. The
Mhm.
other areas, well, we should have it so we have a diversified portfolio, but it kind of gets relegated to the back,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
is it's kind of interesting because in the early development, the first few decades of the GLP-1s, they were relegated to the back at conferences and everywhere else. They would find
Mm.
themselves, in the smallest room at the conference venue talking about gastric peptides. And, nobody wanted to talk. Oh, weight control. No one wanted to talk about
Mm.
it. And there's kind of an insider secret, sort of secret joke, but Novo didn't want to initially continue working in the weight loss space. And famously, one of their execs said that there's no viable business there.
Huh.
And that's well known. And then in September 2023, Novo Nordisk briefly became Europe's most valuable company because of
Mm.
the compounds. So their stock price surged at the same time as LVMH had dropped because of some market pressure with China's economy. So there was a period of about a day, I think, where Novo's market cap was 425 billion. LVMH's was about 420 billion. And
Mm.
so you have a company now leveraging GLP-1s who a couple decades earlier, no one could even get interested in pursuing GLP-1s. So it's funny how that happens.
What kind of impact do you think this fashion is going to make longer term on the way that healthcare operates? In terms of, I guess, the relationship between physician and patient, any changes it's going to create there?
Yes, yes. I see that coming
Mm,
already. So there's a tremendously healthy and unhealthy social media component to all this, as I mentioned.
mm,
So to have people talking about what's working and not working, great. But when you have influencers out there and vociferous anecdotes posted by influencers, they say GLP-1s were the best thing I've ever done, and an equal number at least of posts saying it's the worst thing they've ever done, most often
mm,
owing to sequelae and side effects. Um, so one of the issues I see there for how that affects healthcare, I guess the biggest problem is that these aren't real data. Aggressive anecdotes
mm,
masquerading
mm,
as influential clinical data just aren't. 1,000 vociferous anecdotes do not constitute objective data. As far as your healthcare provider situation, it used to be for the last 2,400 years, you would go to see somebody who was the medician, the
mm,
medical doctor of sorts. In that the diagnostic part was always the most important theme there. So you presented with a series of complaints. I have this issue. It feels like this. And the physician's job was to conduct a differential diagnosis to sort of screen out the various threads. Well, it's, inferentially, it's probably not this. It's probably not this. So using induction, you come up with a differential diagnosis to say it's probably likely this or this,
mm,
right? So in that case, I can write you a prescription for this particular drug, try it out. If it doesn't work for some reason, maybe you're on the other little line of causality, we can try that, but this is the most likely one.
mm,
So you'd present with a complaint, diagnosis was done, and then you were prescribed an appropriate medication. Now, this is all flipped on its head because of impacts like social media. And so, what patients do is they're influenced by what they consume. They go see their provider and say, hey, I could stand to lose 40 pounds. And I just
mm,
saw an ad or I saw a social media post on Ozempic, right? Again, sticking with the brand names. Can I try Ozempic? Now the physician's job isn't to conduct a differential diagnosis. It's either to talk the patient off of a ledge and say, you don't need this because, or it's to kind of do their mental math and say, what's the benefit versus safety ratio here for this
mm.
particular patient? Would this have adverse consequences and they shouldn't? And if so, what do I say? Or is it safe enough where I would feel comfortable prescribing this because they asked me? So, no longer is it just diagnosis leading to a selected therapy. It's patient comes in already in their mind with the therapy that they want.
Mm.
And the physician either says, no, that's not appropriate for you because, or they say, okay, fine, you can try that.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's really upended everything in the last handful of years. So it's really sort of a fascinating
Mm.
situation.
Dr. Google and Dr. Instagram first.
Yes.
You mentioned just now, Ben, there's lots of anecdotes, but a real lack of data. Do you think there's been sufficient long-term studies done on safety and efficacy of GLP-1s, or are we rushing into their widespread use too early?
Well, if I think back to the historical timeline, it's really been about 50 years since we knew about these molecules. As far as doing any sorts of trialing, more like 30 plus years. And they've been on the market now for coming up on not quite 20 years, but quite frankly, there's a lot of clinical data,
Mm,
not only from the clinical trials themselves, but from the millions of patients who've taken these out in the wild, commercialized, approved for use. So, one of the things I think that heartens me is that the clinical trial process itself is one of the, yeah, maybe we're biased here, but this is, to me, one of the best examples of good empirical science that exists in the world, scientific
Mm.
method. They don't always work the way they should. They're not always adjudicated the way probably they should be. But to say, I have a compound of interest, we know the mechanism by which it works, so therefore it should work. There are a lot
Mm.
of other avenues in the world in quasi-scientific fields where that would be enough to say, we understand the mechanism, so, release this thing to the public. But we still require, thankfully, clinical trials to occur.
Mm.
So we're going in saying we think we know everything about the mechanism of action. Now we're going to try it in humans. We're going to try it for safety. We're going to try it for efficacy. We're going to do both. We're going to see how it works in dozens of patients, hundreds of patients, thousands of patients. And then it gets to the market, and now you're talking about three or more orders of magnitude more than that, people who are exposed to these treatments. So we have a lot of real world data,
Mm.
RWD, real world evidence surrounding these to suggest that if there were weird effects that were very rare, we should be seeing these. And certainly there are people who have had serious adverse events with these, and the more general side effects, as I mentioned earlier. But there have been so many patients who have been exposed to therapy with GLP-1s that I think we have a pretty good hold on exactly what the mechanisms of action are and what the safety relative to the benefit is.
Ben, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Over the past year, we've interviewed more than 100 experts in biopharma outsourcing, so we thought it would be useful to distill all those best practices into Outsourcing Fundamentals, an online training course that gives you and your team a foundation in successful outsourcing. Take this course for a comprehensive overview of the key trends shaping biopharma outsourcing. Over 4 hours, this course will give you 10 modules of expert insights and case studies including vendor selection, contract negotiation, quality oversight, tech transfers and more. Each module comes with helpful resources, interactive quizzes and a certificate of completion. Listeners to this podcast can get a full £100 off by using the code POD100, that's POD100, when you get to the checkout. To find out more, head to pharmasource.global/fundamentals.